dial up. How they claiming they on top when I'm a mile up. Got them on now before I dial up. How they claiming they on top when I'm a mile up. I know the wall's closing in, but don't you dare give up now. Hope believe, did me pull up through some bucks down. Tired till the valet pull the truck round. Push the line after we drew it, it's just us now. Would you believe me if I told you my granny told me she prayed this? Then booked the surgery just to pull me out of the basement. Right back where I started, nothing to show for a facelift. Got pushed playing Walter White and Davis, never felt so dangerous. The type of power they can't quantify. And name the best from my region, you gotta utter mine. Think of who really putting on, you never come to mind. Rapping like your Spotify tap, you rappers compromise. Yeah, no need to panic, just paint the canvas. If you can feel the static, you're too close, find your balance. Embed the revolution for their prohibition bandwidth. Learn triple from the lead to see what's planted. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top when I'm a mile up. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top when I'm a mile up. Boy, that flight to Amsterdam. When my accountant of minus my family found out too and didn't like it. You're not in the salon with Dale said and I thought he was biased. Then I got a Venmo that said copy the finest. Before my foolishness said.
Peace, my friends. Peace, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Live in Coffee, Current Events, and Politics in Lukman Nation, the most dangerous show on social media anywhere. It is Friday, January 22nd, 2021. I have to stop and think about what day it is in the era of semi-sequester, somewhat quarantine, because, you know, the lockdown here in the United States is not all that serious. But I'm paranoid, so I have not been going out much, only for essentials. And so I've kind of been in my own little self-imposed bubble here in the Lukman Nation Manse headquarters here. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight for this really important conversation. There's so much goes on in the world that affects us that we don't even understand how it does. And because we have such a lack of understanding about U.S. foreign policy, and especially what the United States does on the African continent, we think it doesn't matter to us, but it absolutely does. And what is going on in Uganda is one of those examples, just one out of many, but it's the one I want to talk about tonight. But before we get into it, again, as always, thanks so much for your support. We really appreciate you. If you like what you see and hear in Lukman Nation, please share this video and the rest of our content. Invite your friends. Right now, I'd really love it if you would share this video. And you can follow us on Twitter at Lukman Nation, the number 1, no space. Like us on Facebook at Coffee, Current Events, and Politics in Lukman Nation. And you can subscribe to us on YouTube under Lukman Nation. So, and also consider becoming a patron. As you can see down there at the bottom of the screen, the little scroll. Our patrons support us. We truly appreciate your support. $3, $5, $7 a month, 20 or more if you can swing it. We know times are hard, but trust me, your support goes not just to support Lukman Nation and the technology stuff that we do that makes these shows possible, but we also use your contributions and support organizations that do mutual aid, that do political education, and that are generally there to exist to help our people. And very soon, patrons, we're going to start providing you a regular accounting of where your money goes. So with all that being said, I'm really, really excited about tonight because, as I said, the crisis in Uganda is very, very serious. And it is a long and bloody and deadly crisis that didn't really culminate with an election just last week because the election results are quite shady. Contested election, but there's a lot of history that goes behind what happened last week, We're not going to be able to cover all of it, but we certainly want to give you a clearer understanding of the history of the crisis in Uganda, the people and the entities involved, and why it all matters to us here in the United States. I am very, very excited to be joined tonight for this conversation by Milton Alamadi. How you doing, Milton?
Hey, thank you for hosting me.
Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Milton Alamadi is the editor-in-chief and publisher of Black Star News, and he is also the host of Black Star News, host and producer of Black Star News, the radio show that can be heard on WBAI, right, in New York City.
Correct. And like you, I also have a Patreon, actually, the African History Club.
Yes, because look, put it out there, because we listen. Do we not know that no one is going to fund the revolution?
Right.
So listen, before we dig into this, I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell people about yourself, your organizations, and how they can reach out and support you and the work that needs to be done in Uganda. Because, I mean, in all seriousness,
right,
we have people who are, we are internationalists here in Lukman Nation. So we absolutely want our viewership, our viewing family and friends to support people who we know are doing good work all around the world. Okay,
very good. Well, in terms of Black Star News, I've been publishing Black Star News since 1997. Let me try to give you like a 3-minute cap, maybe.
Okay.
When I was growing up, I was always really infuriated by the way Africa was covered in so-called Western media. So I'm originally from Uganda, but I grew up in Uganda and in Tanzania as well. So Tanzania at that time had a president called Julius Nyerere, a Pan-African socialist leader that more people need to know about him. So that's where I really started imbibing my political consciousness and Pan-Africanism in Tanzania. So I would read American publications at what they call the United States Information Service Center, which of course, once you become an adult, you realize it's like probably the headquarters of the CIA, right? But as a kid, you go there because they have all these magazines, so you read them. And always like Africans were covered, and people of African descent as well as the other, And so then when I come to the US to go to college, I actually, to be honest with you, I wanted to go to film school. But my late father, may he rest in peace, said, no, that's not a real profession, so I won't pay for it. So study something real. So I studied economics. And then I was working for a few years. But I spent my time writing letters to the editor complaining about how Africa was portrayed, how Haiti was portrayed, Jamaica, you name it. So then my friend said, why don't you go to graduate school, journalism, and become somebody who's inside rather than shouting from outside the walls. So that's why I went to journalism at Columbia. And then when I did my master's paper on African coverage in Western media, I went back all the way to the 18th century, and I brought it up to the 20th century. I read the actual microfilm articles, and then I was really blessed to have the opportunity to go to the New York Times archives to do my research, because I wanted to speak with European Americans who were sent to Africa to write about Africa. I wanted to know what was their mindset, right? And I believe if they knew what they had in the archive, they never would have let me in, because I found some of the most racist correspondence that you would not even believe it. So, for example, I found a letter from a reporter named Homer Bigart. And people, whenever I say their name, they just say, oh, you mean Homer Bigot? Bigot, right, because and in his case, deservedly so. So this guy had won the Pulitzer Prize like twice already when he was at the New York Herald Tribune before he went to the New York Times. So they sent him to cover decolonization in Africa. So he writes a letter to his editor named Emmanuel Friedman here in New York. And he says, I cannot get enthusiastic about these so-called emerging republics. Says the leaders are either mystics or witch doctors, Said Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first prime minister, is like a Henry Wallace in burnt cork. Said, I pretty much prefer to cover the primitive natives because, after all, cannibalism is the best antidote to the population explosion everybody's complaining about.
Wow.
And then I go and I say, let me see the articles that he published. So I go to he wrote that letter December 1959. So I go and I read all the articles that he had published in the New York Times, December 1959, January 1960, and all that. It was a perfect fit between his personal letter and what was purported to be news articles published about Africa in the New York Times. Talked about primitive savages in his articles, right? Primitive natives and all that. And then also found evidence that they manufactured incidents that never happened in Africa and put it in the New York Times articles. So, for example, in his case, Homer Bigard wrote to his editor in New York complaining when he was supposed to cover independence of what was Belgian Congo, which is today Congo. And he said, I could not find pygmies. Pygmies are most the maligned Africans in all of history, to interview them on what independence meant. But then when his article appeared like 2 days later in the New York Times, he's saying, oh, to pygmies, independence means more beer, more salt, or more meat. And then here's the best that I found. I found a letter from Lloyd Garrison, who's a descendant of the great abolitionist, complaining about how his article was distorted. He wrote to his editor in New York, he was covering the Nigerian Civil War from the side of the secessionists, Biafra. And he said, who inserted that passage in my article that I never wrote? And the passage was describing Nigerians dressed in grass leaves. He said, I never put that in. Where did that come from? And he was complaining. And he said, sometimes you keep inserting the word tribesman, tribal. He said, to sophisticated Africans, they know what that means. Right?
Means backward.
Absolutely. They made it up. And they put it in his article. Okay, so let me try to summarize a little here. So I took this all together. I put it in my thesis, right? And then I wrote a paper. And it won one of the awards at Columbia. And then Columbia Journalism Review, which many journalists know about this publication, invited me to submit it for publication. I did. 1 month passed, it wasn't published. 2 months, 3 months, it wasn't published. So I called them up. I said, what's going on? I said, oh, there's been a decision not to publish. I said, why? I said, oh, some people felt these things happened a long time ago. I'm like, wait, number one, how can you study history without going back a long time? Number two, you asked me to submit the paper. And they said, okay, well, 2 editors voted to publish, 2 voted against, and then the top editor, executive editor, opposed it. I said, okay, I want my paper back. And then the managing editor at the time, his name was Michael Hoyt, said, oh, why do you want it back? Then I said, oh, something is going on. So I go straight to his office. And I enter his office. He didn't know I was calling from the same building because the journalism school is below the office of Columbia Journalism Review. So I go in, and he's behind a stash of papers, putting something beneath. And he sees me, and he's shocked. I said, I'm here for my paper. So he goes around like he's searching for my paper, comes back to the same spot, and he pulls it out. I said, something is going on here. So I grabbed my paper from him. I didn't even reach the elevator. I said, let me read this. And then I discovered how much they really feared the New York Times. This is what they wrote on my behalf without my knowledge. They censored themselves, but then still decided not to publish the censored version. But this is what they wrote. This paper is in no way an indictment of the New York Times, because after all, the New York Times in the past has written many insightful articles about Africa. This paper is just to show how any media outlet can go a little bit astray. I said, man, I said, you clowns. So I sent a copy of the paper to the publisher of the New York Times, because I didn't want them to be able to hide this.
Sure.
And they acknowledged the ugly past. They wrote, the managing editor of the Times' name was Joseph Letterville. wrote to me acknowledging the ugly stuff. And and then he said something like, "Well, some of us did work to fight against this, including myself." And in his case, was true. I found in the files that he was actually one of those that was fighting against it. And so that is what really shaped my journalism. That experience, that encounter. So I did work as a freelance reporter for the New York Times for a little while after that. But then I met a paper called the City Sun, which was Black-owned, Brooklyn-based, the best paper in New York at that time. I was surprised I'd never heard of it. So I quit the Times, even though I took like a 75% pay cut. Sometimes, as you know, it's not about the money when you're trying to tell the story of the voiceless. So I worked at the City Sun for a few years. The publisher was a bit senior citizen. When he had a couple of strokes, he passed away. The paper, collapsed.
Yeah.
But I said to myself, I'm not going back to the corporate arena. So that's when I drew up the paper business plan for this Black Star News. I sent it to a lot of people that I knew had deep pockets, including people like Oprah. And most of them wrote back a letter to me and said, nice idea, good luck. But I got a check signed by Camille Cosby, and that's how I launched Black Star News. And
I wasn't expecting
doing up to date.
I was not expecting that at the end there. The Camille Cosby.
Absolutely. That's where it all started. Without that, a couple of checks, actually, I would not have been able to start.
Wow. That now, I mean, I'm so glad that you gave us this background, because I hope that it helps highlight a couple of things for our viewers. Number one, here in the United States, especially, the seat of power, and undoubtedly like the controller of all information that comes out of the West.
Yeah.
We have to be very careful that we do not put these major publications like the New York Times on this pedestal.
Absolutely.
They can never be questioned.
Thank you.
Their reputation and the veracity of their stories can never be questioned, because as you were talking about the depictions of Africans that were being published in places like the Times, if people wonder where these stereotypes about Africans running around living in huts and grass skirts and being cannibals and they're all pygmies come from, the story you just told about your paper not being published by the New York Times ought to give people an idea of why those types of evil racist stereotypes, why they flourished and why they persist.
Right. And I'll just give you two more points very quickly. Number one, after Columbia Journalism Review, I could not get anybody to publish the paper, not even the Village Voice. And the best rejection came from a major corporate magazine, the New Yorker magazine. And they said it's not a right fit for us, blah, blah, blah. But then on the rejection letter, the editor wrote a handwritten note, said, I like this paper, send it to Mother Jones.
Oh.
And then I figured, because the handwritten note would not appear on the rejection copy they kept on their file. So that explained to me, why is he rejecting and then saying this? So I sent it to Mother Jones. They rejected it. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to play this game anymore. So I self-published it as a book, Hearts of Darkness, How White Writers Created the Racist Image of Africa. And now, after all these years, I just signed a contract with a publisher, because when you self-publish a book, it's impossible to get it reviewed, you see? But now I just signed a contract with a publisher, and it's going to be coming out this year with a different name. I think it's going to be something called Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. And to be honest with you, I'm not naming the publisher yet, because these companies are capable of doing anything.
Sure.
And I'm not just speculating. I'll give you one final point on this issue. There's a magazine called Fair with exclamation mark. People in media know it, right?
Yeah.
So many years ago, Fair actually published my paper, right? And it's been there all these years, maybe more than 10 years now. But then recently something occurred to me after the George Floyd execution, public execution. where everybody's now looking back at this history. So I said to myself, you know what? This is the time that I can really finally get that story out. And the New York Times passed that they don't want to come out. Anybody can go to a URL right now and put, because the article, they publish it under the headline, Inventing Africa. Put Inventing Africa and then put FAIR, F-A-I-R, exclamation mark. And then you'll see the link to my article. And then click on the link. Lo and behold, that article has not been deleted from the website. Not by me, obviously.
Not by you,
but somebody who wants this story to never come out had enough interest in making sure that article has now been deleted. As of last year, before George Floyd, it was still up. So I don't see it as a coincidence. Okay, so now I'll stop on that matter, and we can go to that.
Look, this is, as far as I'm concerned, this is your show. I mean, we talk to you on by any means necessary, and 15, 20 minutes it's never enough time to dig into the meat of these kinds of issues. But it's a 2-hour show, and we have a whole bunch of other stuff going on. So I just thought, shot in the dark. Let me see if he'll come on my show, and I'll let him talk for as long as he wants about this issue in Uganda, because it is incredibly important. But the other point that the issues that you brought up made, I think, that are very, very important, is that the forces that shape narratives in this country and around the world,
absolutely,
if they would go to these lengths to keep us from knowing this information, why in the world do we in the United States think we have no connection to people in the rest of the world? But that's a question I'm going to get to a little bit later on. So let's talk about Uganda.
Yes.
Let's talk about the elections last week. The 38-year president, if you want to call him that. A lot of people have different names for him: dictator, tyrant, whatever. Yoweri Museveni allegedly won a hotly contested election last week in Uganda. There was a lot of controversy around the election.
Correct.
One, because of who Museveni is, what he's done over 38 years in Uganda. And the demographics of Uganda. Uganda is one of the youngest countries in Africa. And the young people in Africa, unemployment is sky high among
absolutely.
There's an enormous class divide, the poverty rampant among the poor, among the very young. There's a small group of a petite bourgeoisie, middle manager type of folks who are hoarding all the money and resources. And then there was a young, charismatic young fella who came along, and I'm showing age, young fella, who came along and energized the youth, the masses, and challenged Museveni.
And defeated him.
and so this is where I want you to pick up on the election last week. You say that Bobby Wine, this young, energetic, charismatic young man, actually won the election in Uganda. Don't mind that. That'll come back on. But Museveni and the Ugandan government, and it looks like the United States government and other governments around the world, are recognizing Museveni as the winner of the election. Tell us about the elections in Uganda and why.
Okay, very good. I'm sure you touched on a lot of the good elements actually already. So I will just, add a little bit on what you said. Museveni has actually been there for 35 years now as the dictator. And if people remember Mobutu, the notorious dictator in what he had named Zaire, now renamed back to its original name, Congo. Museveni is the 21st century version of Mobutu. He does exactly what Mobutu did in Congo. He kills political opponents, or he locks up behind bars. He used the military to keep his regime in power. And that's what he's been able to do all these years because he's a client of the United States. He is the typical neo-colonial ruler in Africa. Whatever he does within the boundaries of his country, it does not matter so long as he is our African dictator. He can do our bidding. So what did Mobutu do in the 1960s after he killed the hero of Congo's independence, Patrice Lumumba, brutally murdered? Many people don't even know, but they should know this detail. Patrice Lumumba, this Pan-Africanist, who wanted Congo's resources to benefit the people of the Congo. And they set an example, the way they killed him. Not only was he shot by firing squad, these are Belgian agents, American CIA agents, using local comprador. After they killed him, they chopped up his body, they burnt the body, they crushed the bones, and then dissolved in sulfuric acid. So that Congolese could not even be able to go to a grave and say, here lies our great martyr who fought for our independence and who wanted the best for the Congo and Africa. That is what they did to his body. And then they picked up this CIA agent, and Mobutu, and people can research this, actually became a CIA agent in 1959, the year before Congo's independence, when he traveled to Belgium and he met Western US intelligence sources there, and he became their man. Obviously, Lumumba had no way of knowing this, and he made Mobutu the chief of staff of the army, and he got rid of Lumumba, killed him brutally, and they sustained Mobutu in power, regardless of what he was doing, destroying the economy, killing his opponents, sending them to exile, locking them up, committing massacres. He was placed in power for 37 years. Whenever there was an uprising, the U.S. would intervene using, they would use U.S. planes, and they would carry Moroccan troops. You know, Morocco is a client of the United States. That's to right. Go and help Mobutu suppress any uprising in the Congo. Multiple uprising. The Congolese wanted to liberate themselves, but the West would suppress the uprising. And this is the guy they maintained with U.S. taxpayers' dollars for 37 years until he was aging, sick, he had cancer, then they abandoned him. Now, Uganda, Museveni is duplicating the same schema. Mobutu used to rent his soldiers to fight against sisters and brothers who are fighting for Africa's independence. Because most African countries won their independence in the 1960s, but there were a few holdouts, the Portuguese colonies in particular, in Mozambique, in Angola, in West Africa, in Guinea-Bissau. So here Africans had to engage in guerrilla warfare. But Mobutu would lend his soldiers to the neo-colonial reactionaries who were actually trying to maintain colonial rule in Africa, undermining all Africa's efforts for total liberation. Now, Museveni does the same thing. Museveni has not only destroyed Uganda, but he destroyed neighboring countries. He invaded Rwanda in 1990, invaded Congo multiple times in 1996 and 1997, invaded South Sudan in 2013. So you wonder, how can somebody be this destructive and yet still be supported, and not only supported diplomatically, but financed by the West? He gets $1 billion in US taxpayers' money every year. He's gotten that every year. So that means over a 35-year period, he's gotten close to $35 billion. Well, maybe they didn't start financing him big time. Let's discount the first 5 years. But at least the last 30 years, we're talking $30 billion for the most destructive African on the continent. Had he not invaded Rwanda, the Rwanda genocide of 1994 never would have occurred. Had he not invaded Congo multiple times, the genocide in the Congo leading up to 6 million dead never would have occurred. South Sudan is burning today because he invaded South Sudan in December 2013 and took sides in a civil war when other African countries wanted to resolve it peacefully. He undermined that effort by lending his army to Salva Kiir when they were having a dispute with his vice president. Now, but let me tell you what is a constant in all these arenas of bloodshed, horrific killings, mass rapes of both men and women, which is a new phenomenon, which was unheard of until Museveni introduced that. That not only women were being raped, but men were being raped as well in front of their families, their wives, to humiliate them and emasculate them. That phenomenon was first confined to Uganda, but after Uganda invaded Congo, the Congolese started saying this, wait a minute, we've never heard of this. Not that rape of women is not atrocious, but I'm just saying they pointed out that a new type of atrocity had been introduced in the Congo from Uganda. This is all due to Museveni. But let me tell you what is constant when all this is happening. Mm-hmm. Western corporations are making money. So this is like a manufactured genocide on behalf of corporate interests. So if people go to the website of Friends of the Congo, they do a phenomenal job. They've listed all these Western corporations, American and European, that are making billions of dollars at the same time that this horrific war was going on in Eastern Congo.
Now I have to tell you, just really quickly. Now I'm rereading How Europe Underdeveloped Africa.
Yes, brilliant book.
The first time I read it, which was I don't know, maybe 10, 11 years ago, probably. Yes, it had an impact on me, but because then I didn't even understand the connection between U.S. foreign policy,
yes.
American consumerism.
Yes.
And, materials, resources, yes. and the exploitation of the people
yes.
on the continent of Africa, mm-hmm. It did not have the impact on me that it does now. So
I agree.
Now that I understand more yes. about these things and the connections of yes. these things, just the countries that you mentioned that Museveni yes. has contributed to yes. destabilizing, continued right. to destabilize.
Right.
What he has done, and this is just for people who don't get why we should care about this. What he has done by doing these things was to make it possible for U.S. and Western countries, France, Germany, Belgium, the UK, former colonists,
yes,
the former colonists of these countries,
absolutely,
to continue to maintain ownership,
yes,
of the means of producing goods
absolutely
from the resources in those countries.
Absolutely. All these products are being discounted by the blood of Africans. I like the way you put it. And that book really captures it. And another book, a good book, is Kwame Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. This is a book that is a worthy investment for anybody that is interested in global affairs and African affairs and the plight of Africans. And in the Congo, of course, it's, you name it. Congo has everything. Mm-hmm. It has coltan, which is one of the world's leading deposits of coltan, perhaps 60% found in Congo. And that's a mineral that is found in pretty much every electronic equipment. So we are getting it subsidized because millions of Congolese are getting killed so that the Congolese government cannot get the fair price mm-hmm. for this product. We would rather finance Uganda or Rwanda, have them invade the Congo, kill even millions of people, so long as corporate interests are not upset, so long as the corporations are able to mine the resources from this so-called war zone, a mm-hmm. war zone where only civilian victims, the young, women, the helpless, are the victims. But people involved in mining the resources, of course, they're not touched because they're the ones behind the conflict. In mm-hmm. South Sudan, it's oil.
Right.
Major oil reserves. And that's why they would rather have Uganda destabilize South Sudan and turn South Sudan into a client state so that South Sudan could be exploited with Uganda as the launching pad. And in the case of the Congo, by invading Rwanda, Rwanda also turned into a launching pad for invading the Congo. So this whole enterprise is just to keep Africa divided, weak, not being able to build viable, autonomous economies that are not tied by the umbilical cord to the West. They can actually make independent decisions for themselves. Because ask yourself, how is it that you find the most impoverished people in Africa, yet resource-wise, it is the richest continent in the world? It is poverty by design, because Africa is not allowed just to have stability alone, to even start building the foundations of development and progress. And Nkrumah warned it in his book. He said, they will not allow us to be stable. They will not allow us to unite. And I'll give people another reference point as an example that they can help them understand. Look at China. China, as recent as the 1940s, was how Africa is today. You know, it was the playing field for the West. They could do anything in China, exploit the Chinese, take Chinese resources, turn Chinese into dope fiends in an earlier era, you know, with opium.
With the Opium Wars, yes.
Right. And as recent as 1958, 59, Ghana in West Africa had a per capita income that was double that of China. It was about $200 per head. China was about $89 per head.
So
Look at where China is today.
Country.
Sorry?
So China was a truly impoverished country.
Absolutely. Not only impoverished, but weak, not able to defend its sovereignty. So the first thing China did was to be able to secure its borders and say, take your filth out of China, so that we can start using our resources and our ingenuity, our intelligence, and our citizens to build up China. Africa has never been allowed that opportunity. That is why, as I said, from 1959, Ghana having double per capita income. Of course, today, China's per capita is about 5 times or 6 times that of Ghana, because Ghana, by African standards, people would say it's doing well, but it's still that little one country. Had Africa been able to fulfill Nkrumah's destiny and unite, just think about it today, Africa would be a power, just like China is a power today. Because after all, China is increasing its power by doing what? Using Africa's resources. Because China now has the technology and it gets the raw material from Africa. Now, let me come back to Museveni. Now, but I think this broad overview gives you now a better understanding why it is important for the West to have an individual like Museveni in power,
right, in
an African country. They would rather have the Musevenis in every African country instead of having a Patrice Lumumba, instead of having a Thomas Sankara, instead of having a Kwame Nkrumah. These were thinking smart Africans who had a game plan for the total liberation of Africa. As Nkrumah said, the independence of Ghana alone is meaningless, if not with the independence of the entire African continent. And by that, he meant once we have political independence, we can secure our borders, and then we can start using our resources. And he tried doing that. He tried industrializing Ghana, and he was overthrown. So that is why the West will go out of its way to prevent a person like, or anybody, but in this case, Bobby Wine, defeating Yoweri Museveni in Uganda. In fact, this process in Uganda would not be called an election anywhere in the world except in Uganda. How do you call an election when the incumbent killed at least 100 people during the campaign period? 54 shot in broad daylight on one day, November 18, when civilians protested after the arrest of Bobby Wine. At that time alone, let's say something like this were to happen in a European country. Do you think they would see this as an election, really? The incumbent doing something like that? So why do we accept this diminishing of African value, of African life, and they still want to go ahead, business as usual, and continue to do business with General Museveni. So that is why you find me involved in all these activism. And it's not only for Uganda. I show up when the Congolese are struggling. When the Congolese call me, I'm always there on their marches. When the South Sudanese call me, I'm always there in the forefront. When my sisters and brothers from Cameroon call me, and they're fighting this dictator who's been there for about 40 years, supported by the French, a multi-billionaire, while his people, are starving. When they call me, I'm there on the forefront of their struggle as well.
And Brother Milton, I can't help but make the comparison between, what you just said, that Museveni murdered 100 or had 100 people murdered before the election.
Yes.
If that were to happen here, what would happen? Well, I can tell you what happened, because a bunch of people believed a lie about a stolen election in this country, and they carried out an insurrection, or at least carry out an insurrection against the United States government. Now, listen, I've said before, I have no love for the United States government and this non-democratic process.
Right.
I'm not upholding the sanctity of U.S. elections.
Right.
But in this instance, in the context that these folks were angry about, this particular election was not stolen from them. They were just mad because their white supremacist messiah didn't actually win.
Absolutely.
So, we know what happens in Western countries when they think that their so-called democratic elections are not. They get angry, they protest, and then
absolutely.
In the absolute extreme, what happened here on January 6th, is what happens. So, but I think the reason we don't care about what happened in Uganda's election is because what we were talking about before, the way Africa is portrayed in Western media.
Absolutely.
Because we have been convinced that Africans are just backward and ignorant.
Absolutely.
And some of the comments, I have to say, Brother Milton, some of the comments that I've seen, that I saw on Twitter after the election was called for Museveni, there were people who were saying, well, look, the election has been called. The people have spoken. Why are y'all still mad?
Exactly.
So it just blows my mind. But I wanted to really quickly hop over here in the comments and greet folks who are here. People are being, usually the chat is on fire with folks, talking, amongst themselves. But I suspect that this conversation is broadening some horizons and blowing some people's minds. So I'm hoping that people are just sitting there watching rapt, and people have been appreciative of the books that you have shared. I shared the titles with them, and our friend and comrade Netfa Freeman.
Yes, good comrade. Yeah.
And he said that we have to be clear about what Nkrumah was teaching us, that Africa as a united force and a powerhouse is only possible by rejecting capitalism and embracing continental socialism. We must include that to do justice to Nkrumah's watchwords.
Absolutely.
Show this again, and insights. And
I agree with him 100%. I agree with him 100%.
Yeah, because you are an economist, I need to have you back to talk about how important socialism.
I am at your call and bidding. Believe me.
People keep telling me that, and they think I won't. Okay, all right then.
I'm at your call and bidding. I mean, I teach at John Jay as well, and I get the greatest satisfaction. By the end of the semester, my students are totally transformed. Once they're exposed to Nkrumah, they're exposed to Patrice Lumumba, to Thomas Sankara. It is an amazing transformation. This happens every year.
I'm not a student of yours, but I'm telling you, when I read the speeches from those men and read some of their works, and I haven't even gotten through everything because I haven't read that Nkrumah book, but it's on my list.
Yes,
I was transformed from believing that there was nothing wrong with capitalism, and you can have a more what do we want to call it? A more humanistic or humane
Right.
capitalism to understanding that capitalism is the problem. It is the problem, and the only solution for us is international socialism. But okay, that's an aside. Let's get back to Uganda and Museveni. And now let me ask you about Bobby Wine,
Yes.
because I think part of what I see us do in the United States, and I don't know, maybe this is just a human kind of thing, where we prop up people, you know, as leaders, and we make heroes out of them, and we don't critically assess their politics, their support, who they are bankrolled by, and who they're reaching out to, and you know, so Bobby Wine, legitimate contender for the presidency of Uganda, had enormous popular support.
Yes.
You say he won the election. I don't doubt you. I believe he won the election too. But what should we know about Bobby Wine that is not being told to us about him in the U.S. media? Because the U.S. media just keeps describing him as a pop star. Right. And I think there's more to him to that. So what do we need to know about Bobby Wine?
Right, very good. So he's 38. He grew up in one of the so-called ghettos in Uganda. And the young people started referring to him as the ghetto president. Because, I encourage people to research some of his music and some of the short films that he was producing. And the narrative is always the same. Challenging the corrupt state, the corruption. The state which has the ordinary Ugandan, particularly the young Ugandan, which is actually pretty much all Ugandans, because the country is 80% under the age of 35. But a voice like this would never have the chance to really break out, because if you're not part of the system, and Museveni has a very tight ruling elite that comes from his particular part of the country, the western part of the country. So if you're not in that circle, there's no way can you have the financing to launch a serious independent candidacy and challenge a person who pretty much, and I'll give you a quick example, the World Bank gave Uganda $300 million loan to fight the COVID pandemic. The minute the money was made available, it was diverted to the military, where Museveni and his top officials can then plunder it and use part of it for the repression that they see in Uganda. So how did Bobby Wine get his financing? From his music, primarily. He was phenomenally successful in his music and his film, and he started investing in agriculture. He invested in properties in Uganda, and he developed an independent financial base for himself. And then he ran for parliament in 2017, very recently. Just a couple of years ago, he still had his locks. So of course, before he ran, he cut his hair, and he stopped smoking weed. And funny, that was one of the things that Museveni was trying to use against him during the campaign.
Really?
They were making posters. Why would anybody want to elect a pothead or something like that? But the Ugandan youth say, wait a minute, you see that as a negative? We don't see that as a negative at all.
Yeah, that's not something you can shake kids with.
Right? So he managed to build his independent financial base. And then he started going on a voter registration drive. And he brought in millions of new young voters to the voting roll. And that's how he was able to transform the equation. And Museveni truly started panicking and started becoming violent against him. And the more violent and repressive Museveni became, the more popular Bobby Wine became. So in fact, Museveni made Bobby Wine who he is today. One of the most famous incidents, because this is what happened. He started campaigning and endorsing people that would be running for parliamentary seats that became open. And some of them became open after some very suspicious death, in Uganda. So maybe in some cases, people believed Museveni perhaps was not getting along with a particular member of parliament, even though the member of parliament belonged to his party. So he would have them eliminated. There were suspicious car accidents, for example. There was poisoning in another instance.
Wow.
And thinking that perhaps the new member of parliament that came in would still be on his party and would be a little more amenable to whatever he wanted. So Bobby Wine campaigned on behalf of people who were running for the same seats. And in two straight campaigns, the opposition candidate beat Museveni's candidate for parliament. So Museveni realized this is a serious character, right? Bobby Wine. He started becoming really afraid. And in 2017, in August, 2018, in August, there was an election where he went out personally to campaign for his candidate. And Bobby Wine went to campaign for the opposing candidate. And the crowds that showed up to Bobby Wine's campaign, overwhelming compared to the tiny crowd that showed up to Museveni's campaign.
Wow.
Museveni knew he was going to lose. So he instigated an incident, and people think he was actually trying to kill Bobby Wine because he had his soldiers fire into Bobby Wine's car, but they fired into the driver's seat. And it happened that his driver was actually sitting on the driver's side that day. So his driver was killed in a hail of bullets.
Oh,
and then Bobby Wine fled and hid in this hotel. They surrounded the hotel. They went room by room. They finally caught him, stripped him naked, beat him viciously, and they tortured him. He said even his genitals, were tortured with equipment. And they kept him. People didn't know where he was for 3 days. Many Ugandans believe that Museveni wanted to kill him at that point, but that some soldiers were not willing to do it because they knew how popular he had become by that time. So eventually he was produced in court, bruised all over, barely coherent, being held up,
Mm-hmm.
And that's when he really became internationally big as well.
So Netfa's comment again that Museveni made Bobby Wine.
Absolutely. That was the incident that really made Bobby Wine.
Yeah.
And then he came to the U.S. For treatment. And people didn't expect he would go back to Uganda after that beating he had experienced and the torture from Museveni. Museveni himself probably thought, okay, I finally rid myself of this potential dangerous character 2 years away from the next election. He went back to Uganda and he was met by tens of thousands. People just lined up the streets from the airport to the capital city. So Museveni panicked again, and they took him in a helicopter so that he wouldn't drive through the tens of thousands waiting for him, and flew him to his home. And at that point, it was obvious that there's going to be a cataclysmic clash at some point. The youth and Bobby Wine against the old corrupt regime of General Museveni. So that, the sparring built up between 2018 up till the elections, the so-called elections of January 14, which he lost. And he can't even explain it. There was one simple question, which because he appoints the election officials, right?
Of course.
So obviously, they're not going to announce anybody else except him. Mm-hmm. But there's a problem. If you're going to steal, you have to steal in a credible way. Here is one question they cannot answer. He shut down the internet completely, total blackout, 2 days before the election, meaning information and data cannot be transmitted. How was he able to transmit the data from the 314,000 polling stations around the country to give him the total number of votes, which he claims he won by? So when a sharp reporter for Al Jazeera asked him that question, wait a minute, when you had the internet blackout, it did not affect only opposition. It affected everybody. So how did your election commission get the raw numbers that they added up and gave to you?
Yeah, because
the election commissioner could not answer the question. He said, we devise our own system of doing it. Yes, of course, your own system. Your system is making up the numbers, you know.
Yeah, because when you shut down the internet, it
affects everybody. There's no private internet for
no one has access. Wow,
so that's why it's so prosperous. And then there's another thing that is fearing. The opposition and young people are very savvy. So what did they do? They developed an app called You Vote. And the app allowed people, after they voted, to, at the polling station, they have something called the declaration return forms, which list all the candidates, the total votes they got, and that form is signed by a representative of all of the candidates. So people took pictures of it and they uploaded it on the app. So even though the internet was shut down, it was already stored on the app. So now that the internet was turned back on like 2-3 days ago in Uganda, all these numbers are now showing up on the You Vote independent app. And the You Vote app, based on 4,000 polling stations so far, shows Bobi Wine leading 72% to Museveni 25%. And people believe that is the actually much more realistic outcome of this election, because they don't believe that the millions of young voters that Bobi Wine signed on would end up voting for Museveni and giving him the so-called 59% win. And the person that is leading this, the creation of this app, is a professor based in the Netherlands, working with all these Ugandans. He's a trained physicist, so he has all the data to back this, and they're coming up with a conclusive report that they want to provide to Bobi Wine in case he decides to challenge the official election results in the Ugandan courts. The Ugandan courts are packed with Museveni's appointees, but they believe that the information is so solid that they would make really fools of themselves if they still end up claiming that the numbers given to Museveni are authentic numbers. That's number one. Number two, the app also allowed people to actually videotape incidents of election rigging, such as like soldiers stuffing ballot boxes. They took videos and it's the app. So they have this information as well. They have video of soldiers giving voters ballots that had already been pre-ticked with Museveni's name ticked, and telling voters to stuff it in the ballot box. So they have overwhelming evidence. And I think actually that is why some of the statements coming from the West toward Museveni is very different from what I've ever seen before. I've never heard the United States call a Museveni election as fundamentally flawed. That's a very strong term. If somebody has conducted a fundamentally flawed election, it's how do you recognize? And that is part of the reason why, in fact, we're having a protest at the United Nations tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. And we are challenging the United States, saying you've already said the election is fundamentally flawed. There's no way can you go ahead and still recognize Museveni as the legitimate leader of Uganda as of January 14th.
That is some wow. That is some deep stuff. I am blown away by that, and I am actually blown away still, because the election was on the 14th, the January 14th. And I'm still kind of processing the fact that U.S. Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat of New Jersey, was the one who called out the fraudulent elections in Uganda, and I'm just read his statement. I mean, I don't like any of these people. I don't like.
I know what you mean. I
don't want to give any of these people credit for anything.
I know what you mean. Especially after 35 years.
But Senator Bob Menendez, who, by the way, has his own corruption problem in New Jersey. That's another reason why I know.
I recall that.
But he's right in this case. He said, quote, sadly, Uganda's January 14th elections were yet another reminder that the Museveni regime has no interest in respecting the democratic aspirations of the Ugandan people. The pervasive harassment of opposition politicians, the obstruction of election observers, repeated abuses by security forces and internet blackouts, and allegations of vote rigging have cast serious doubt on the credibility of the entire electoral process. At this juncture, I call on Ugandan authorities to cease their campaign of harassment against Uganda's opposition and other independent voices, including leading presidential contender Bobi Wine, who remains under house arrest. And that's where I want to go next. Aside from asking this other question about Bobi Wine, because there have been questions raised about him, about support from U.S. forces
Absolutely.
and other.
And those are legitimate questions too.
Yeah. What is it? Is there anything of concern? Is there anything that we should be concerned about? Who in the U.S. is supporting Bobi Wine, and what nefarious intentions that could lead to?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, obviously, the U.S. would obvious that they think Museveni has exhausted his usefulness. That is quite clear. And if Bobi Wine should be sworn in as president, they want to have maximum influence in Uganda, and that is not surprising. Here's the sad thing that has happened in Africa. In the 1960s, and it's not by accident that we don't hear the kind of names that we used to hear. Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau. People should read his essays by any means, just look up his collection of essays. People like, of course, Kwame Nkrumah. People like Thomas Sankara. People like Modibo Keita. People like Julius Nyerere. Even from South Africa, even though he never became president because he was murdered in 1977. Mm-hmm. People like Steve Biko.
Yes.
These were fertile minds who imagined a different destiny for Africa that did not have to kowtow to the West. People who were able to deconstruct the history of Africa's engagement with the West and understand that this is not only the only economic system. Yes, I agree with NETFA. We just posted Chris Hani, of course. There's so many. But I say all this to say that today, we don't have these kind of African thinkers emerging. And it's by design, because none of the institutions in Africa are teaching so-called radical economics. The only kind of economics taught, as if it's the only economics in the world, is neoliberalism. The same thing just as in this country. How many colleges in this country teach economic thought, economic system that challenges the neoliberal regime? It's been particularly destroyed because whereas people who used to go to the universities, like University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, mm-hmm. would study these alternative forms of economic thinking, now the best minds are absorbed to work with the NGOs. They're called NGOs, but they're actually funded by governmental entities, right? Mm-hmm. So the NGOs, non-governmental organizations in Africa, funded by the USAID, for example, and they're still called NGOs. So as Issa Shivji, who's a retired professor of economics, political economy in Tanzania, and if people want to look him up, Shivji is spelled Shivji, Shivji. First name is Issa, Issa. And he has some lectures on YouTube as well and some books. And the way he put it was the best, that in the past, they used to tell Africans, work locally, but think globally. Today, they tell Africans, young African bright minds, work locally, but don't think at all. We'll do the thinking for you.
That sounds like American. Sounds like American universities.
Absolutely, and that's what's really happening. So there's a great vacuum in terms of analysis, critical analysis, imagining an Africa that's going to be different. So I think the process of heading Uganda and most African countries in the right direction is going to take some time. because the Western countries are not going to allow Africa to develop economically independently and be able to challenge the West and become another competitor. Look at China. Look at how China is abused today. But why is China abused? China is abused because China is now a global competitor on the economic field, on the political field, on the military field. So that's a very good abuse for China. China would rather endure that kind of abuse than the exploitation that existed as recently as the 1940s. And China is respected. Africa is not respected. Africa is abused. Africa is exploited. But it can turn around. It can turn around because millions of Africans are yearning for an independent Africa that can guide its own destiny. And that is why we must take interest in what happens in Africa. And we must make sure that we also play our part in getting rid of a person like Museveni, who is destructive not only to Uganda, but as I outlined, to the entire East and Central Africa region. He's not, as Nkrumah said, they will use a leader who does not have to take care of the interest of his own citizens or even pay attention to the votes. So long as he's okay with the West, he will be the leader. And Museveni fits that characterization to a T. And this book was written in 1965. But he had the experience of Ghana when he was coming up. He had studied the system very well. And he had a very good tutor too, George Padmore. George Padmore was the one who really tutored Nkrumah in political economy. It's interesting. There's an interesting story, which is in one of C.L.R. James' collection of essays. C.L.R. James writes that, I wrote a letter to George Padmore because, Nkrumah went to school in the United States in the 1930s. He went to Lincoln University. And then before he went to London and then back to Ghana, he met C.L.R. James. And C.L.R. wrote a note to Padmore in London and said, I forget Kwame Nkrumah's given English name. He used that name. He didn't use Kwame Nkrumah. So anyway, he says he uses that English name. Is coming to London. He says he has potential. He's not very bright, but he has potential. Work with him. And then C.L.R. James is very honest, at least. He came back years later and wrote me and said, you know what? I have to admit that in terms of learning, I never met a person who learned so quickly from George Padmore and transformed himself and became fully knowledgeable in dialectical materialism and economic history and political economy. He said Nkrumah did that. The Nkrumah I met was raw, but the Nkrumah that went under the tutelage of George Padmore was completely transformed and understood as much as I did. He said in the beginning, when they used to have conversations over political economy, Nkrumah would make remarks that convinced him that this guy doesn't know what he's talking about.
But that is, for me, that's such a heartwarming and beautiful and encouraging story because, brother, so much of this information that we need to have, we need to have this information like we need air to breathe. That is how I feel about, and people are, always ask, why are you so serious all the time? And y'all are always on this Pan-African stuff. And this is all y'all talk about. Because we need to understand how critical the continent is.
Absolutely.
To the survival of everyone else.
Everybody, except us. We are the ones with the least knowledge and understanding. The ones who don't have our welfare at hand are the ones who have the most knowledge. Think about that.
And it is encouraging to hear that story about Kwame and because I keep reminding myself, I have to keep reminding myself of something that Kwame Ture said, that, there was a time that I didn't know what I know now. Yep. So, we have to be a little gentle and have a little grace with folks who do not know what we know. So I appreciate the ability that I have to talk to people like you to help make these connections And just the community that we have, this community of struggle for our people and the whole planet, that we can draw on this deep well of knowledge. And look, I don't want to be, we could be here all night, but I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that.
Well, as I said, I'm at your call anytime you need me back. Just let me know.
But I do want to ask you one more question about Uganda and the connections between Uganda and especially what happened on January 6th in the United States, the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Because most people watching know that the Lukmans are people of faith. My husband used to be an imam. He is still, very immersed in Islam. But we're also members of a progressive Christian church. And the canon of Uganda visited our church in 2012 when he talked about HIV/AIDS and the fight against it in Uganda, and in particular the Kill the Gays campaign that Museveni waged. There is a great documentary that I'll put in the chat called The Pearl of Africa that people should take a look at. In regard to the fight against Museveni's horrendous Kill the Gays campaign. But I think this brings me to the question of the involvement that Museveni has, not just with right-wing elements from the United States and in other countries, because he does. And then remember, this is an African general involved with European white right-wing fascist organizations, but also, excuse me, but also his involvement, or should I say, the involvement of U.S. Christian fascist organizations and the way they pushed this Kill the Gays campaign that he embraced full-heartedly. What is the connection between what I call the Christo-fascists in Uganda, and some of those people are also the ones who were deeply behind Donald Trump and this insurrection? So you take that away.
Okay, so there are a couple of levels, and there was, and it's really very challenging for people that actually take Christianity seriously to refer to them as Christians, right? So I'm glad you actually said Christo-fascists, which is absolutely what it was. And it was primarily used to drive a military agenda in Africa. The U.S. has always wanted to have AFRICOM located in Africa instead of Stuttgart in Germany. But as reactionary as some African rulers are, none of them would survive by agreeing to allow AFRICOM to be fully based in Africa. I remember one time when Liberia was on the verge of agreeing or had agreed, Nigeria said, no, it won't happen, and we'll make sure it won't happen. Meaning Nigeria would have been willing to clash with tiny Liberia, and that would not have been a clash at all. So that is where most African countries are on the same page, because they know the nefarious nature of allowing AFRICOM to be based in an African country and then spread its tentacles throughout the continent. So Museveni has been the most accommodating of all the African leaders. And he came to a meeting of the mind with the United States and played up this militia rebel called Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda as this terrorist organization that was actually threatening stability in Uganda. When in truth, it was a marginal outfit and could have been destroyed a long time ago if Museveni wanted to destroy the Lord's Resistance Army. Museveni actually was providing arms to the Lord's Resistance Army so that the Lord's Resistance Army could exist. And he would use that rationale of fighting this brutal terrorist outfit that is cutting off the lips of civilians, cutting off people's ears. Yes, the Lord's Resistance Army was doing some of that, but Museveni's own army was also doing a lot of that, and then blaming it on the Lord's Resistance Army. And the U.S. has intelligence in Uganda, so the U.S. knew the true nature of the Lord's Resistance Army, that it was not a really credible force that could threaten stability, but still used that convenient excuse. And that's when the evangelical groups in the United States also signed on. And they had this one particular outfit called Invisible Children. That was supposed to be a Christian charity as well. That is actually promoting the deployment of U.S. military in Uganda to fight this demonic Lord's Resistance Army led by Joseph Kony. And as you remember, it was during Obama's administration that they actually signed off on deploying, I don't remember how many hundreds initially, of U.S. soldiers to go help Uganda defeat the Lord's Resistance Army. They made a video called Kony 2012. It became phenomenal. It was viewed 100 million times initially, when in fact, by that time, the Lord's Resistance Army was no longer in Uganda. It was all the way thousands of miles in the Central African Republic. But did you get this critical analysis in any of the major media?
No.
Of course not. You did not.
I heard about Kony 2012.
Exactly. And then they went about as if going with the same narrative that, yes, we do need to deploy U.S. military in Uganda to destroy an outfit that was no longer in Uganda. So you had major outlets like the New York Times going with this propaganda of the U.S. establishment.
Now, let me stop you there for just a second. Let me show you how deeply entrenched this situation is with our everyday lives here in the United States. People always talk about we don't have anything to do with what goes on in Africa. A friend of Lukman Nation, Chantel Guerrero, and my personal buddy, says, I remember raising money for invisible children as a kid for our church.
Yes.
I used to belong
millions of dollars.
Yes.
Yeah.
I used to belong to a church that raised money for invisible children. I remember the pastor, black man, preaching, would show the video and look at what's going on, and we need to root out these evil people. So there are connections to the continent that touch us every day, whether we want to believe it or not. But please,
when the biggest evil person actually was General Yoweri Museveni at the same time. He'd already launched that genocidal war in Rwanda by that time. He'd already launched that genocidal war in the Congo by that time. But now he's using that same propaganda. Now he's on side of the so-called angels, the United States, invisible children, and the people that are making Kony 2012. And so now the demon is Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army. And all these major media are going along with it. The folks that made the Kony 2012 video, Invisible Children, they were met in the White House, in the Oval Office with President Obama. So how do you counter that narrative that, listen, there's something wrong with this story? Yes, Joseph Kony is terrible, but General Yoweri Museveni is perhaps 100 times worse than Joseph Kony, who's no longer in Uganda, by the way. Museveni is responsible for the death of more than 1 million Ugandans. When you find the entire population of the northern part of Uganda for about 20 years. And very few people even know about this story. People can go online There's a documentary called A Brilliant Genocide. And if you go to YouTube, you'll be able to see this documentary and it will inform you. So when you're faced with this kind of media false narrative, propaganda, when the major corporate media buy into it, because obviously they serve the government agenda at the same time. So now you have the CNN, the New York Times, all of them working hand in hand with the true criminals, really, who made Coin 2012 and the US government. Can you really counter this? Well, I tell people never give up, right? Mm-hmm. And let me give you an example. I wrote an article or a commentary, and I exposed Coin 2012, and the article went viral. And how was I able to do this? Thank you to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks had a document documenting a meeting that happened with the United States ambassador to Uganda and these folks from Invisible Children that ended up making Coin 2012. And the meeting, the young folks, these young European Americans, said, we can help you sell this plan to deploy American soldiers in Uganda. So they discussed and hashed out the idea together, how to make Coin 2012. But how many people knew that the US government had a role in the making of that so-called documentary in order to push and pave the way for military deployment? So you have the American political and military establishment pretending like, oh, whoa, what a brilliant, informative Coin 2012 this short documentary is. Oh, yes, we must take action now that we've learned what's going on by watching Coin 2012. When in fact, they made Coin 2012. And some people wondered, how did this thing become that viral? 100 million views? There's got to be some play in the system. It can't just be because this was such a brilliant documentary out of the blue. So now it makes you wonder, when you have these guys who made Coin 2012 appearing in every network, on the morning shows, on the evening news, everywhere, was this by accident? Or was it well coordinated in advance by some in the media, the corporate media, as well as the US government? But let me go back to the point where I say, don't give up. I used the evidence from WikiLeaks showing how, in fact, this was a US project all the way. It went viral, and then people started like dumping on Coin 2012. So by the time they released the video, it just collapsed. It didn't go anywhere. And not surprisingly, the article that I wrote exposing this nefarious relationship, if you go to my website now, guess what? You won't find it. So if you go to other websites, there's a couple of websites that wrote story, Coin 2012 exposed as US, propaganda or something, right? And then they would discuss my article, and then they would link to my article on my website. So if you click on that link and you go to Blackstone, you'll see a blank page.
But see,
so I've had a long experience of people that don't want some stories to be told, undermining me and deleting them, but it's all good. We keep doing it because, enough people end up reading it anyway,
And that's why we have these conversations. That's one of the reasons why these kinds of conversations are so incredibly important. This has always been my mission. When I got involved in this, when my husband convinced me to do this online video thing, whatever it is we're doing, I just want to tell the stories of people who Nobody wants to hear their stories because they are vitally important to our survival.
Absolutely.
So listen, this is the last thing I'm going to share for people to see. There is information. Let me see if I can get this right now. There we go. Yeah, there's information, all the information you want to learn and more, of course, about Uganda on the Black Alliance for Peace website. Of course, I have to tell you, I am a member of Black Alliance for Peace. They have updates on the situation in Uganda. There's an article from Bobby Wine here and other information, not just about Uganda, but about things that are going on all across the continent. And trust me, friends and comrades, I will be, I keep forgetting that I have to actually share this. There we go. There you go. There's your Black Alliance for Peace website. There it is. And this is information that all of these issues that are raised on Black Alliance for Peace that you can find on that website. I intend to cover them in some way. I intend to talk about them in some way and make the connections between why we need to be concerned about them. But Brother Milton Alamadi, I cannot thank you enough.
Thank you so much.
Thank you enough for your time this evening.
I hope we'll have this conversation again.
Look, we're going to have to just make this a monthly occurrence.
That's good enough for me.
You come on and I just sit here and drink tea and let you do whatever you want.
That's good. Okay, I'm on for that. I'm on board.
Where can people find you? How can they support you? Where can they find information that you've written so they can stay informed?
Yes, of course, to the website as well, blackstarnews.com. They can also follow me at Alimadi, my last name, Allimadi. So it's at Alimadi, that's on Twitter. And also I have on Patreon, African History Club, where basically once a week, I just discuss some aspect of African history. And I'm doing episode number 24 next week. And I started from the origination of humanity in Africa. That's episode number 1, because I thought it was important for people to know that all humankind started from Africa. It was only recently, only about 100,000 years ago, that human beings actually left Africa and went to other parts of the world. And then due to climatic conditions and environment, they adapted to their new surroundings. And that's how we ended up with Asians, with Europeans, and other forms of human beings. But originally, we are all Africans, actually. So I like to teach my students, even Europeans and Asians are Africans. They have just adapted to the environments where they went over a period of 20 to 40,000 years. And that's how their features changed. As Anta Diop pointed out, had Africans never left the continent 100,000 years ago, everybody would be African. So it means everybody actually is African.
Woo, that sounds like some homework right there, y'all. So listen, Brother Alamadi, thank you so
much. Thank you so much.
I appreciate the time and your wonderful insight. We will see you again very, very soon.
Okay, stay strong, sister. Thank you so much.
You too, brother. Thank you. Y'all, I'm fitting to shout. That was just, y'all go ahead to that man's Patreon and support him if you can. Go to Black Star News and read all of the information we have on that site. Check out Black Alliance for Peace and stay informed on the goings on in Africa from the standpoint of anti-war and the fight for peace on the continent that is important to everyone on this planet. And listen, if you like what you see and feel in this my nation, please consider becoming a patron of this my nation. Luke My Nation. As always, y'all, take really good care of each other. I appreciate you so much watching tonight. We will have another exciting show Wednesday night. I am going to save who the guest is going to be until a little bit later, but it's going to be a lot of fun. We appreciate you so much. As always, be really good to each other. And I say to you, please, if you are willing to fight for it, because you absolutely have to fight for it.